Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. Britain's economy shrank in the last 3 months of 2010, shocking experts in the city and industry. Latest figures show a contraction of 0.5%, raising new fears about the recovery. Poor weather is being blamed for some of the downturn. The Chancellor admitted the figures were disappointing, but George Osborne said he would stick to his austerity programme. For Labour, Ed Ball said it was time to change policy. Here's our economics editor, Stephanie Flanders.
Add everything together and you get Britain's national output, GDP. For most of 2010 it was getting bigger, but in the last 3 months the recovery stalled. The ONS says the economy shrank by 0.5% in the last quarter. Without the bad weather, it would have been flat, with growth of 0%.
It was the coldest December for 100 years. People couldn't get to work, businesses were closed, and that's had a bigger impact than anyone forecast. But if you look at areas not so affected by the weather, like manufacturing, they are growing. That's an important part of rebalancing the British economy.
Inflation up, unemployment up, the recovery stagnated, and that's even before this year's spending cuts hit. This is really, really concerning. And my advice to George Osborne, don't blame the weather, change your mind, get a plan B, get a policy for jobs and growth, and do it quick.
This construction company in Warwickshire's doing OK. It's rehired the workers it let go in the recession, but work for households has dried up. It's commercial jobs that are keeping them going, and they have to fight hard for those.
I think probably because the costs are so low. I mean, we've all had to the last sort of 18 months to really drive down our costs, overheads and everything to, to compete for because there isn't that much work about. You've got to really try harder and sort of work harder and longer to get it,
There's a sharp divide between different parts of the economy. Construction output fell by 3.3% in those 3 months. Retailing and other services also shrank by 0.5%, but manufacturing and other production grew by 0.9%. The message seems to be anyone relying on the British consumer in 2011 could be in for a rough ride. Household budgets have taken a beating in the last few years, and they're going to be hit again this year by higher inflation and higher taxes. Now more than ever, to keep the recovery going, the government's counting on companies, investing in the future and selling more overseas. In the markets, the pound fell on today's figures. That could be good news for exporters if it makes their goods cheaper abroad, but the word on everyone's lips was stagflation. The word comes from the mid-70s, but then stagflation meant a continually shrinking economy and inflation running at 25%. We're nowhere near that today, but even if it's stagflation light, it doesn't feel good.
I think this rather uncomfortable combination of quite high inflation and weakness in the economy in general is going to continue for at least a few more quarters, and of course that does provide the policymakers, the Bank of England at least, with something of a dilemma.
As it happens, the bank's governor, Mervyn King, is giving a major speech tonight in Newcastle. The figures are likely to be revised one way or another, but right now they suggest our central bank was right to warn about taking the recovery for granted. With inflation still going up, they've also made the difficult job of setting interest rates that much harder. Stephanie Flanders, BBC News.
And we can talk to our political editor, Nick Robinson. He's in Downing Street for us. Nick, George Osborne insists he'll stay the course, at least publicly. Privately, do you think there are any jitters?
Well, they certainly were taken by surprise by the figures, George, and usually the Treasury doesn't get taken by surprise. And that will cause real anxiety. Only a few weeks ago, the Chancellor was telling us that the good growth figures showed that the doomsayers had been proved wrong. Now, inside number 11, they're hoping that this is one statistic and one cause, that bad winter weather. But they are, of course, nervous, and the pressure is now on them to come up with some sort of growth strategy. After all, the leading businessman, the head of the CBI, Sir Richard Lambert, yesterday criticised the government for the absence of just that. They will now look, I'm told, at changing the planning laws, changing the tax regulations and other things in the Chancellor's budget, because they have to show now that they have a strategy, not just for cuts, but for growth too.
And this coincides, does it not, with Labour having Ed Balls as Shadow Chancellor. And he's a man who knows how to go for the jugular.
That's exactly right. Now, of course, every opposition politician knows the last thing you do when the news is bad for the economy and therefore bad for people watching this programme is go around with a smirk on your face. But Ed Balls is a man walking around with a sign across his head, really, saying, I told you so. He is the new Shadow Chancellor. He did warn that spending cuts could lead to a decline in growth. But of course that begs a question for him too. When Alistair Darling was in that building behind me as Labour's Chancellor, he planned dramatic cuts this year. Worse, he told me in an interview, than Margaret Thatcher has. So will Labour now call for those cuts to be stopped, to be slowed down, to be altered? That's a question for them. One thing is clear tonight, George. One stat doesn't make a political winter, but today the political and economic weather changed.
All right, Nick, thank you.